Hi everyone, this recording is going to cover using the dodge and burn tools in Photoshop, which are traditionally photographic tools for darkening and lightening areas of an exposure within a photograph. I'm going to use them slightly differently today. Dodge makes things lighter and burn will make things darker, and they live one on top of the other here, and I am just going to go and grab dodge and burn. I may even have time to talk about the sponge tool as well, but I'm just going to grab the dodge tool, and using the square brackets on my keyboard you can adjust brush size. I'm using a fairly soft edged brush today. It is a fairly standard soft edge brush, but you can go and find a nice brush with a nice soft edge if you prefer it. And I'm also today going to be working without a Wacom tablet just to see how I get on, but obviously this tool would be greatly improved, as all painting tools are, by using a drawing tablet. Right, okay, so you've got a way of setting ranges here, so it will either lighten the shadows, midtones or highlights within your image, and it will look at that range, roughly third splitting your shadows, midtones and highlights through the histogram data, the data that builds up the tones in your image. You can set the exposure to pick up more or less of that, and therefore work more softly. So I've got this as a fairly low exposure there, under 50%, or quite harshly if you whack it up above 50%. It comes in at 50 by default. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'll start at that default and we'll have a look at that. And I have also just set this to highlight range, so that when it lightens things, it's only lightening the highlights or large areas of my image that are basically pale in tone. Now that's looking pretty strong to me. Again, without a Wacom tablet, it's just full on whack there. I'm just going to step back on that Command Z and I'm going to adjust. So you may need to do this a couple of times, especially if you're not using a Wacom, to make a more subtle effect. So I'm just going to lighten the sky area of that image and some of the water too. That's looking pretty good. I'm quite happy with that. Now you can also set this to midtones and shadows for a less strong effect when you're highlighting things. So I'm just going to, again, if I just step backwards, just switch this over to midtones. This is how I prefer to use it, to be honest. And I'm going to keep that exposure nice and subtle, so it's about 20%, and I'm just going to lighten that sky area again. I think you'll appreciate there is quite a massive difference there in how, you know, majorly it is lightening those areas, and it does look a little less weird than it did. Okay, I like it. So that all looks good. I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to come in this time with the burn tool. The burn tool again, square brackets on your keyboard to adjust size, and range, midtone, shadows, highlights. I'm going to just change up the shadow tones here, and the exposure here, I'm going to take that right down because I don't want to burn this image out too much. And then I'm just going to literally just quickly darken the foreground areas to sort of bring them into a sort of more focused, jungly type arena. Right, that looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with that. Just to remind myself what my image looked like when I started, I'm going to have to step back in history here because this is a destructive edit, but I'm going to show you a sneaky little trick for using dodge and burn with a non-destructive outlook. Let's have a look at that now. So I'm just going to reopen the image. There's where we started, and this time I'm just going to make a new layer. That's where the plus sign. I'm going to get my fill bucket, and I'm going to select a pale grey paint or a mid grey paint and just fill bucket that layer. Perfect. And now I'm going to set the blend mode on that layer to overlay. Let's do that. So that's overlaying that grey, so strong contrast between these two layers. It's picking up on those midtones between those two. And I'm going to go grab my well, I'll start actually with my dodge tool, and this time, again, exactly the same as settings as I had before. It will store them from later. I'm just going to work on that grey layer, and you'll see that it has exactly the same effect as it did when I was working on the original pixel data, but the added benefit here is that we're working non-destructively. So that layer, there I can just switch that on and off to reveal the changes that I'm making. And again, same with your burn tool. On a grey layer, I'm going to switch the eyeball back on that, it will just darken those areas as we did before. So we're basically back to what we'd done destructively before, but we've got that added benefit of being able to step back and go back into the original pixel data if we need it. So I would always use dodge and burn on a grey layer set to an overlay blend mode. Now I'm just going to switch this layer off for a second, eyeball off, and just go back onto my background layer to show you what the sponge tool does, because it's a little bit strange, the sponge tool. And again, I'm just going to make a nice big brush here. That's probably a little too big, about a 10p piece worth. And you've got two modes here. You can saturate with the sponge or desaturate. I think it's Adobe being funny when they call it a sponge tool, because you're basically mopping up or adding water to the situation. So it's up to you. So I'm just going to go grab the desaturate version, and I'm just going to take some of this colour out of the background, so you can see that that's desaturating that area. And I'm going to switch to the saturation mode to heighten and brighten the foreground. So that might be a really good way of picking out areas of your image if you want to change up or adjust the focal points without mucking around with adjustment layers. It's just a quick and easy method of doing that. I'm just going to switch layer 1 back on and show you, let's just switch layers. It will not do the same thing, I'm afraid, as your dodge and burn. You will have to work destructively to use that sponge tool, but at the same time, if you just save a duplicate of your file, you'll be fine.